The stories of covenants between God and God's people that we've looked at through these last Sundays of Lent cover a very broad expanse of time, likely some 1,500 years or more, from the prehistory of Noah to the beginnings of the people of Israel with Abraham and Sarah, to the exodus of those people with Moses from enslavement in Egypt. And now, in today's reading, well beyond the crossing into the Promised Land, the great united kingdoms of David and Solomon, to a nation conquered, their holy city overtaken, their temple destroyed, now exiled in Babylon, scattered in a foreign land. The covenantal relationships that bound God and the people seem to be broken and in tatters, except that God's promises and God's faithfulness to the people is constant. It is the people who have been unable to maintain their part of the commitment to obey the commandments handed down to Moses at Mount Sinai, and to remember God's goodness and mercy that brought them out of Egypt. The prophets were called to warn the people of the consequences of their unfaithfulness, to get them to turn back to God before it was too late. There was Isaiah and Amos, Hosea, many others, and in our reading today, Jeremiah. For 40 years, Jeremiah prophesied. A peace-loving man, he was fired into passion about God. He rebuked kings. He preached to his fellow Jews that they had broken God's heart, breaking the covenant again and again, turning away from Yahweh, chasing after other gods. For his trouble, he was imprisoned, put on trial for his life, and thrown into a cistern where he would have died had a friend not saved him at the last minute. It's believed that he was ultimately dragged off to Egypt and stoned to death. At the point where we meet Jeremiah today, though, in the midst of lamenting the present circumstances, he proclaims a word of hope. Israel will be restored. The day will come when there will be a new covenant, not a covenant that replaces those given before, but one that renews and builds on them. And in this one, there is something entirely new. Unlike the covenant at Sinai, it will not be etched on tablets of stones. It will be inscribed on the hearts of the people at the very core of their being. No longer will there need to be a checklist or a book of rules. The knowledge of God and God's love will be as close as breath and the beating of their hearts. The promise is profound. I will be your God, and you will be my people. This promise is ours as well. And though more than 500 years after Jeremiah's time, Jesus came to show us how to live as God's people. 2 millennia later than that, we don't seem to have achieved the dream of God's kingdom. When we look inside our own hearts, we might wonder if we are any more faithful than the Israelites. Oh, the gods we chase may be different. Gods of busyness and distraction, gods of self-interest, success, material wealth. We become captive to harmful habits. We hurt one another, even those we love most dearly. Our best intentions of loving God and neighbor become buried beneath other priorities. We are able to know what is good and right, yet we continue to make bad choices. In Jeremiah's exilic times, some of the people believed that God was done with them, that the world they had known was coming to an end. I've heard things like that in the past year or so. Have you? People once again reading the Bible for clues to the end times and wondering if they are near. Perhaps, though, we are in a time not entirely unlike the Israelites' exile, a time of brokenness and distance from God. Covenants seem to come in times of crisis and transition. And this covenant of which Jeremiah spoke was in the future tense. The day will come when I will make a covenant. I will be their God, and they will be my people. If the people believed what Jeremiah told them, if they were assured that restoration would come, even in the brokenness, they could then make room for hope and for healing to begin. Yet still we wait in this broken world in need of hope and of healing. What might it look like if the covenant was so deeply, indelibly written on our hearts that our actions and choices were guided toward loving kindness? Now, I don't see this as a microchip that controls our every thought and act. God created humanity not as robots or wind-up dolls, but for relationship, with the ability to think for ourselves and make choices. So what then is our role in this covenant? Our active role in what God has promised and initiated. Preacher and homiletics professor Fred Craddock claims that the gift of this covenant is a will, a human will with a capacity to be faithful, thus changed from the inside out. I'm not entirely sure what Craddock had in mind, perhaps an upgrade to our human software that would give us some new functionality that we didn't have originally. Other biblical prophets and writers talk about the heart. Ezekiel prayed that our hearts of stone be changed to hearts of flesh. The psalmist that we heard today prayed that his sins be purged, a clean heart be created. For them, in the ancient world, the heart was where the will resides. Not flowery and romantic emotions, but the will. So perhaps our role is one of response, of setting our will toward God until God's love and mercy becomes as close as our breath and the beating of our hearts, and the covenant is fulfilled. As we turn toward Jerusalem in these last days of Lent, may we turn our hearts, our wills, toward God in penitence and in hope, to letting go of all that separates us from the one who created us for relationship, not blind obedience to a list of rules, but to be changed from the inside out, becoming God's people so that God may be our God. Amen.